Alright, we are back yet again, and starting as ever with some admin stuff. Firstly, over on the World of Tanks side of the world, I am doing a chat with the author of The Tank Killers, Harry Yide, on the evening of the 24th. It's a live event, consider it a bit like a book club, except we get the author involved, so you've got a couple of days to read the book right quick and maybe come up with some questions or discussion points. Then you get the two guys who literally wrote the books on the US Tank Destroyer Force answering your questions on stream. I note that Ian over on Forgotten Weapons has actually managed to find Elbonian firearms to review and even has a t-shirt. So I guess we need to come up with something for the Elbonian Armoured Corps. You know, through the mud and the blood to the muddy fields beyond or something. For those of you who don't know, Elbonia's main export is mud. Anyway, if you have any logo ideas, throw them into the comments below and we'll see what we can come up with. Hopefully you caught my two-parter over in the World War II channel on the Soviet armor around 1941 and the video on the introduction of the 76mm M4 over on the World of Tanks channel, although that one isn't so much new if you read my articles. Not much else to say, so on with the questions. Commissar Carl. Nowadays, it looks like the military sets out a design requirement and puts out a tender to private industry to see which company can best achieve it. In World War II, though, it seems that ordnance were the primary designers and they simply put out the designs to private industry to build. So for World War II, how much influence would the factories doing the production have in the design of a tank? Your observation is basically correct. However, I am going to reserve the matter of defense production for a dedicated video, I think, now that you bring it up. It really is worthy of more than a 3 to 5 minute overview. The short answer is that ordnance knew what the factories were capable of, and if they had to modify the design, such as to make cast versus welded, they would do it. Reagan Thomas Slatter. What is my favorite Star Trek ship and which version of Enterprise is my favorite? I don't know if I have a favorite per se. I mean, on pure aesthetics alone, I do like the Mirandas. There's workmanlike, especially with the roll bar and weapons pod, and there is something to be said for USS Vengeance though, just because cool. Which Enterprise is my favorite? I don't know, the inflatable one from the Practical Joker. Very cost effective. Grim. Why does the US have an aversion to AA systems in general? Were the M247 and XM246 as bad as all the stories paint them? Alright, this is where some of you can pause, open up another tab and go back to Grim's question on the previous Q&A. I guess it was Grim's question. Anyway, it's something I brought up. The bottom line is that the US hasn't seen any great need for air defense because the US has the US Air Force. If you're going to be limited by budget, is it really worth putting all that extra dollar amount into air defense instead of using it on something that the Air Force can't do for you for free? At least that's as far as I gather. I should add, I did receive a message from a rather put-out Avenger driver, or crewman, Kyle Delisle, wondering what it was I had against the vehicle and that I would see fit to replace it. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the vehicle per se. I have no doubt that it achieves the design requirements well, whatever they happen to be. You have to admit, though, it is rather limited in capability. Even the Linebacker had a 25mm. There are not many air defense systems which use missiles of that small a size, and I suspect that lethality against a variety of targets out there today is a little bit limited. Stinger does make sense when you're carrying the thing on your back, but if you're going to mount it onto a vehicle, are you sure it's worth only having a 3kg warhead? It replaced the Vulcan and Chaparral AA system, so one must wonder if it was an improvement in capability or just an improvement in cost effectiveness. That said, the IM SHORAD comes equipped not only with the quad pack of Stingers, but also a 30mm gun and, somewhat surprisingly, twin Hellfires, which I guess an armoured attack helicopter would be more concerned about than a Stinger. As to the second part of the question, no, they weren't actually all that bad. There are arguments that the better system did not win, but I am not sure quite how substantiated they were. I haven't seen the full reports, but I have seen at least surveys of the crewmen who operated both systems, and they considered it a bit of a wash between the two. One would be better at one thing, the other would be better at the other. I was interested to note that some problems were common to both, such as complaints about how inconvenient loading the ammunition was. The chances are that the argument the Sergeant worked the 247 won because of the 40mm proximity fusing, I think, is correct. It was a large capability that the 35mm on the M246 simply didn't have. The main reason that Sergeant York was cancelled seems to have been a chap by the name of Greg Easterbrook, a journalist for The Atlantic. By the time M247 had been approved for production, there was a short list of things remaining to be rectified, most significantly due to the speed of acquisition, but generally speaking it seemed to work. The stories about issues such as locking onto toilet roof fans are A, a little overstated, and B, generally resolved by that time. There is a long version to the story, but the short version seems to be that Mr. Easterbrook wanted to make something of a splash with an investigative story and decided to take up the DIVAD project, as he hadn't heard much about it from anyone, but he did know that the things cost over $6 million per unit, which at the time would have been about thrice the cost of an M1 tank. By the time he was done, helped by some naive folk in the army who didn't realize how things that they said could be taken out of context, it was starting into a national scandal. Eventually ABC got involved as well, using dramatic video, such as older test footage when the system was missing more often than it was in reality at that point. Eventually the political heat was too much and Weinberger cancelled the program. Whether the cancellation was actually justified is questionable. It had been approved for production after passing through the Army's procurement system, even if perhaps approval was not entirely unanimous. If you recall the Air Force colonel in the Pentagon Wars, the M247 equivalent to him seems to have been a Lieutenant Colonel Tom Carter, and his report started getting circulated around through less official channels. Maybe the Army tried to hush him up, or maybe he may have been on a personal vendetta out of line with the actual reality on the ground. There seems to be no way to know without actually reading the reports, which I haven't done because I haven't seen them, and so I can't tell you one way or the other which is actually true. Mechanical Adept asked the long debated question, what are the pros and cons of a diesel power pack over a turbine system for an MBT? Do I have a preference from a crew perspective? That argument has been going on so long, I'm not sure what I can offer to add to it. First, the obligatory chart. The turbine gives you a lot of power advantages, and there's a reason why nations have been looking into the things for years, but only 3 tanks have ever entered service with one. There's probably a reason for that too. The normal arguments against a turbine are fuel consumption and heat. The heat one I think we can generally discard. Normally the engine's at the back of the vehicle, which shouldn't be pointing to the enemy in the first place, and secondly, the way thermal imagers seem to be these days in FLIR systems, there seems to be very little problem picking up normally diesel powered vehicles anyway, so just how much worse can things get? Besides, the heat warms up the engine deck, which stays cozy and warm for quite a few hours after you shut down, and also allows you an easy falling asleep. It's also extremely handy when waking up. You can also always tell which tank has the engine on by simply looking to see which tank everybody is standing behind. I recall well the evening of the 1st of November 2004 doing a run in Iraq, wearing everything the Army gave us. It was god-awful cold, or at least it seemed it after the preceding summer. So we'd pull over after about 10 minutes, the loader would hop out, defrost in the exhaust for a minute, and then I'd hop out and defrost in the exhaust while he stood guard, and then we'd drive on another 10 minutes and then we'd keep going. Now the driver and gunner were fine because the tank's internal heater worked great, but when you're sticking your head out and the cold air is going past you, it's another matter entirely. The exhaust can also be used for crowd dispersion and to penalize civilian drivers who tailgate you. Fuel consumption can be addressed in a couple of ways. Put a good auxiliary power unit into the tank is one of them. The APU from the 80s was utterly hated, and despite options like the Under Armour APU, which was basically a little tiny turbine, it took until about the late 90s for a proper APU to be introduced which was acceptable. The S-Tank had its own inbuilt APU in the form of the diesel engine, and T80, I'm not sure they ever really solved that problem, but I could be wrong. Turbine also draws a lot of air. The filters do need to be maintained. Now they worked fine, but you did have to clean them. Not that it was a particularly hard process, but still. After the M1A1 AIMS, to include the aims, a partial self-cleaning system was added to help that. So what you'll see is you're driving along, but every 15 minutes there'll be puffs of dust coming out of the exhaust as the air cleaners reverse their flow. On the plus side, the number of moving parts in a turbine is very small, and the power advantage, of course, the chart I showed earlier. The tank has a lot of get up and go, especially when not on a straight, level and solid. I figure also that turbines have improved a tad in the 40 years since the AGT 1500 was selected. I would have absolutely no quarrel personally if the next generation tank also had a turbine as well. Time Bomb 757, and you must have an interesting time at airports with that name, but anyway. Do I know why the British and Americans tended to like their engineering vehicles to come with a big demo gun like 165, whilst other nations did not? Honestly, I do not. Having the gun, which is basically the same between Centurion, Avery and the M728 CEV, strikes me as being a perfectly reasonable thing. You can use it to blow up or weaken obstacles, which can then be more easily demolished clear with the dozer blade, for example. However, there must be a reason that a lot of the current stuff, such as Trojan and ABV, no longer use a gun. What that reason is, I'm only speculating, but I suspect it to be related to the preference to use the roof space for things like fascines instead of a turret with a demo gun. It may be worth looking at the story of the Chieftain Avery, which had two designs created. One had a gun and the other just had a huge winch. In the end, a gun-armed version was considered too slow and heavy to keep up with Challenger 1s, so the Chieftain Avery was built without the turret and gun. I'm afraid somebody else is going to have to answer that one though, all in all, so I'll be sure to be checking the comments below before the next Q&A to see if any engineers have chimed in. George Paramore, did the US ever consider another medium velocity tank gun after the 75mm? I don't know if the 75 was particularly considered a medium velocity at the time, the existence of the 3-inch gun notwithstanding, but no, I can't really think of any such. I'm not sure I can really envision a reason as to why they might want to do such a thing. If you want a small gun, it can still be high velocity. If you are willing to sacrifice velocity, then just go the whole hog with like a 105. The only remaining reason to go with a lower velocity gun is if the mount you are trying to put it onto can't accept the recoil of a high velocity gun, but low velocity is unacceptable for whatever reason. That, though, has historically been sorted out through the use of muzzle brakes, improved recoil systems, and longer recoil strokes, which spread the force out over a longer time. I guess it might be possible to consider the M36 90mm gun as a medium velocity if your basis for comparison is a T14 that we saw in Super Pershing, but it was still the fastest gun that they could make work in the vehicle, which of course is why the 75mm was chosen as a tank destroyer weapon. They could mount it onto a vehicle. The 3-inch, they still needed to invent the right vehicle to put it into, i.e. the M10. The other caveat is the 6-pounder, which was known to have a higher velocity than the 75, but the 75 was retained as it was felt that the larger round would keep momentum and thus velocity better over distance. The 57 would just slow down too quickly. He also wants to know what's the deal with metric versus imperial versus pounds and why the US and British kept bouncing around between the lot. I have no idea. What I find more interesting is how countries which never ever were using inches, like the USSR, ended up using 3-inch as the caliber for their guns in the 20s and the 40s, being, of course, 76.2mm. And this whole thing lasted quite a while. The M107 and M110, for example, were built at exactly the same time. One was an 8-inch gun, the other was a 175mm. Now that may just have been a legacy thing though, as the 8-inch was supposed to use the older ammunition from the older 8-inch guns. Finally, did the British ever try a 75mm Sabo? I don't know. I've asked around, I haven't heard. I mean, I've heard back, but I haven't heard. Certainly the US tried a 75mm HVAP and it did work, but they decided not to divert the effort or resources towards them, so none were fielded. Ian Barlow, your question about Challenger 2 being removed from service appears to have been overtaken by events. When initially postulated, my position was that it was probably just a PR stunt by the Army in order to continue funding. I don't personally believe there was ever any great likelihood that the tanks would have been withdrawn from service. Parallels with the US Marines are not applicable. Firstly, the Marines have an entirely different focus, and secondly, if the US Marines really do need a tank, I'm sure the US Army would be happy to come to their aid. The British Army wouldn't have such a fallback option. Connor Dodman: would Soviet tanks and tank doctrine be in any way substantially different if the requirement to include political ideology at every level was less stringent? I don't think so. Presumably he's referring to my video on Soviet armor doctrine in the interwar period. So I'm going to quote two excerpts, if I can find them, from military publications translated for the US Army, as just as matters of interest. Here they are. They are a little long, but I think they'll get the point across. Listen to the words, and then figure out what it is that they're trying to say. It is necessary to develop in every way the Leninist tradition of constant and mandatory participation of the supervisory cadres in the political and military upbringing of the men. It is necessary to reinforce and improve the practice of carrying out unified political education days in troop and naval units when supervisory officials from military districts, groups of forces, fleets, as well as large units, simultaneously appear before personnel in companies, batteries, and equivalent subunits during the hours of mass political work. In solving such an important task as forming a communist world outlook and fidelity to the military oath, one must not forget about developing in troops the steadfast irreconcilability towards imperialism and bourgeois ideology and morals as to a form of spiritual aggression against social consciousness. Today, it is a question only of this. In the military environment, there can be no place for political immaturity and naivete or for instances of loss of class feeling. Again, a longer one from the second article. In accordance with the requirements of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee, one of the most important tasks of the Soviet armed forces is the reliable defense of the peaceful and creative labor of the Soviet people. Therefore, questions of ideological support of the tasks of combat readiness and troop training must continue to be on the main axis of our ideological work. Filling training and service with high political meaning enables the servicemen to understand and feel the full depth of their social responsibility for security of the socialist fatherland and the whole community of fraternal countries. Ideological upbringing work must take into account that the combat readiness of units and ships under present conditions has become a factor of tremendous importance, which leaves an indelible imprint on the entire structure, rhythm, and features of military service. The entire arsenal of ideological upbringing resources is called upon to bring to the men's profound consciousness and provide moral support for the need for constant high combat readiness. Stemming from Lenin's postulate that in any war the victor in the final analysis is determined by the spirit of those masses who spill their blood on the field of battle, the party sees the need for the systematic and all-round training of soldiers in peacetime for possible ordeals. It is important that people's consciousness be prepared to spring to the defense of the socialist fatherland at any moment with weapon in hands and to fulfill their sacred military duty to the end. An indomitable desire to serve the fatherland with honor is one of the most important general qualities of the Soviet soldier, which is extremely necessary under the conditions of modern warfare. The most favorable prerequisites for solving this task are created by exercises conducted in conditions most closely approximating those of combat. Therefore, it is very important that our ideological efforts in the course of military training be indelibly linked with concern for high-quality field exercises, drills, and measures accomplished in the daily stream of Army and Navy activities. After all, it is clear that even well-thought-out ideological upbringing work carried out against a background of poorly organized combat training, which has conventionalities and oversimplifications, will not have the desired effect. Therefore, it is important to concentrate the efforts of all ideological cadres regarding this question on improving the effectiveness of the training process and on struggling against indulgences in military exercises and tactical, firing, and specialized training. For these purposes, we should better propagandize the leading experience of commanders, political organs, and the party political apparatus of units and subunits. It is important to strengthen attention to the methodological training of officers and to arm them with active methods for ideological work in field conditions, exercises, marches, tank parks, and artillery training schools. In connection with this, it would be useful to think about the further development and improvement of the field base of ideological work and to improve more effective forms of ideological influence on the men. Now, what all that translates to is, the first paragraph or segment says, senior leaders need to show that training is important by showing up for it when subordinate units do it, which is not particularly surprising, although granted in this particular instance the training in question is purely political. The second long sequence of 3 paragraphs basically says, it is our responsibility to give troops realistic, effective training if we want them to be successful on the battlefield. The dates of those articles? 1985. So regardless of how well couched in the appropriate political terminology they may have been, the bottom line is that the guys in charge are professionals, normally, and are doing what any professional around the world is going to do. They just take 3 paragraphs to write what a normal person would take 1. Once the big grand strategy questions of what shall be the makeup of the military structure, or is the army to be one which supports revolution outside of Russia or one which focuses purely on defending Russia, were sorted out in the 1920s mainly, the ideological terminology seems to have turned into tools more than actual sources of thought. The development of doctrine was generally rational and based on pragmatic concerns, rather than the hope of proletariat uprisings, especially after a couple of wars showed that the latter was not something to be relied upon. Really, it's no different to the US. Instead of, what we do in the US is, instead of saying politically approved words like Leninist and imperialism, instead we say politically approved terms like leverage all aspect integration and safety oriented with mitigated risk aversion. Whatever gets you the good mark on the OER. To say something completely simple in a completely incomprehensible manner. Hugo U. Why did the Panthers remain the interleaved versus staggered system all the way through production? Remember, Panther 2 and King Tiger were going to be staggered. Probably because they were in production and stopping to change over really wasn't worth the trouble. A quick glance at Jens's Germany's Panther tank indicates that there was some intent to build the Ausführung F with staggered pairs of road wheels, but the one that was built and photographed is interleaved. And yes, to answer your other question, large hatch Fireflies did exist. Van Owen, given the long hours spent in an armoured vehicle, are there any unusual or interesting ways that crews find to fight boredom? I.e., mucking with the boiling vessel, jabbing the driver with a mop handle, or knitting. The mop handle is used for waking the driver up when he falls asleep, and if his intercom isn't turned up loud enough for us to wake him up by yelling. I don't think we ever mucked around with it other than that. There isn't actually a whole hell of a lot of room in a tank for shenanigans anyway. The most we did was just to hook up the intercom set to an MP3 player and listen to music or audiobooks. Otherwise, you're down to just conversation. I did bring a magazine or 2 along on occasion as well sometimes. At least that was my experience. Maybe the tanks populated by the lower classes, i.e. the ones without an officer in it, had more boisterous times. But the other catch is that ultimately a tank is a pretty damn expensive piece of hardware with buttons you don't want to accidentally hit, and I would think that most NCOs are professional enough to keep the horseplay to a minimum. Also, what officially sanctioned devices or additions were made to Allied vehicles to counter handheld anti-tank weapons, such as the German use of Chieftain? This is as opposed to field modifications, like putting planks of wood on the side, extra track, or whatever. Well, there wasn't really very much which entered the field. I can't speak to the British, but the Americans were ruthless about AR 850-15, the regulation which governed the weight and dimensions of vehicles. It ensured that vehicles would fit anything from the ships to the standard combat engineer bridge assigned to the type of unit that the vehicle was assigned to. It wasn't that the requirements could never be waived, but they always looked very askance at doing that. Probably the reasons that the Allies didn't implement special defensive equipment like the Germans did, though, is that the Germans simply didn't introduce equipment requiring such defenses until late in the war. The requirement for Schutzen was made obvious by late 1941 with the predominance of the Soviet 14.5mm anti-tank rifle. But what were the Allies facing at the time? Magnetic mines, a couple of Panzerbusch? Faust Patron didn't show up until late 1943. Yeah, the Italians had lost the 20mm anti-tank rifles, but by that point you were talking about a level of armour which may as well protect you against 37 or 47mm gunfire, i.e. proper tank level armour. The US did try a few solutions, the famous one probably being the plastic armour. In quotes, it's not actually plastic. However, while it worked, it also added a ridiculous amount of weight. I have the document around somewhere, I can't find it in recent look, but I seem to recall that the front armour package alone added about 4 tons to the weight. I mean, okay, it worked, but they figured that if they really wanted to add that much weight to protection, they were probably better off just adding more armour steel. Kind of like the Sherman Jumbo, really. May not have been quite as effective against Panzerschreck, but would certainly help against smaller rounds and against pretty much most of the standard armor-piercing firing anti-tank guns that were out there. The lighter option, which was decided upon as being the most successful in terms of protection against shape charge rounds, and probably also the most unpopular with the crew, who had to be really careful not to slip and fall and who no longer had places to sleep, was the spike armor, which deformed the shaped charge cone. The Germans surrendered before that armor could be fielded, even if they felt they could get the crews to keep the stuff on. Christopher Hewitt had a similar question to Ian Barlow about possible divestment of tanks. Here's the deal. I don't think it's as yet possible to replace a tank. There is nothing which currently exists which can do what a tank does. Yes, a helicopter is faster and can kill tanks from further away. A helicopter can't hold a hill for days in the middle of a major storm. A tank has more stowed kills than a missile vehicle and can probably make those kills faster. A tank requires some pretty hefty weaponry to kill it, but you can probably take out half the anti-tank missile vehicles with a caliber 50. The US Marines can afford to lose the tanks. Now, actually, I note that many of the Marine tankers have now joined the Idaho Guard, 116th Cav, and they even swore in wearing Marine camis. I don't know if getting rid of every last one of them to include the reserves was a good idea, but it does make at least some sense for the Marines to do it, and it's not irredeemable a loss. Or irreversible, perhaps, better word. And again, if they need a tank in operations, the Army will be pleased to help them out, as the Commandant suggests in his document. And should they decide to reverse course, again, the US has the knowledge and the supporting infrastructure in the Army. If the British Army divested all tanks, again, and I don't see that happening, they don't have anybody to turn to back them up and fill the capabilities gap, and they would also lose very quickly the institutional knowledge of tanking. Caleb Engelhardt, is playing dead a viable tactic for a tank? Can it work? Sure. Not sure I'd risk it though. Imagine an excitable tank crew cresting a ridge, seeing an enemy tank which appears to be intact and is not burning. A large number of tankers are going to put a round into it before stopping to make sure one way or the other. You may be better off getting out of the tank, hiding in a nearby well-concealed trench and waiting for the enemy forces to go by before remounting your tank. He also asks, would people be upset if I started to drive like I was in the Dukes of Hazzard? Probably. I'm in Central Texas, my cars are German and they're not painted orange. I don't think the reference to my sliding across the hood, jumping through the window and then peeling out would really be recognized. USA, USA. Probably should be pronounced USA, USA, but it reads USA, USA. Does tank ammunition have expiration dates? Do you load the oldest ones first? Yes, and not exactly. Yes, they have expiration dates, but it's normally a good number of years, and it can be decades if you store it correctly. You load what you get, but when the ammo dump sends you the ammunition, they will normally send you the older lots first. The exception would be in combat. Oftentimes the new ammunition will be distributed first, with the older stuff in reserve or relegated for training purposes. Due to time constraints, I am skipping Gun of the Month this month. I have range qualifications tomorrow. I have to be up at 5 a.m. It is currently 10:30 p.m. and I still need to put my armor together. We're getting the new M17s. I haven't seen them yet, and I have no idea how the heck my unit ended up getting them so quickly, but it'll be interesting. I like SIGs. I think I might have mentioned that. Is there a book which comprehensively covers all US tank development between World War I and World War II? I don't know if there actually is. There are certainly books which cover the organization as a whole in that period, such as Forging the Thunderbolt or Men on Iron Ponies, but when it comes to the vehicles themselves, I'm not sure. Maybe faint praise if you can find it, and I've lost it. It's on my hard drive somewhere. The Honeycutt books will cover them, but you need to have both Stuart and Sherman in order to get them all. On the plus side, you also get all of the World War II development as well, so it's not exactly a waste of money. Christopher Whitmer, what would I say was Sherman's finest moment? Aracourt, Dompierre, another one? If you don't know what Dompierre was, it's a little bit less known, but it's kind of like Aracourt with more Allied air power and a stupider enemy. The Germans lost 43 Panthers and 26 Panzer IVs, the French lost 2 Stuarts and 6 Shermans. So you remember that scene in Band of Brothers where the infantrymen are under heavy German armor attack and a column of Shermans shows up? Or there was a similar incident in the Pacific where the Marines were under a Japanese tank attack and a column of Shermans show up? I would suspect that for any individual infantryman who is thinking that he really could do with a tank around now, and some of them just happen to show up, that tank is probably the finest, most glorious thing that they have ever seen. And since there were a lot of Shermans, and they did get around a lot, they probably had many such finest moments. Overall, though, I'd probably go with El Alamein. When Grant showed up, the British had a tank that the Germans had to respect, and when Sherman showed up, they got one that was better than the opposition in almost every respect. They were introduced in numbers, and they were effectively used against an opponent without any excuses of being undertrained, of the opposition side. Sherman definitively put the Axis onto the back foot. Polygon Wonderland. There is a minor controversy in the comments of the Tank Museum's video on the Battle of Arras. Is it fair to judge early and pre-war tanks based on ergonomic concepts that weren't really well developed at the time? So I went over and I looked at the comments section. Yes. It's like saying it's not fair to rate a trireme on hull form because hydrodynamics was not an acknowledged science. As I understand it, ergonomics as a science wasn't categorized until well after the war. However, it doesn't take too much digging in the records to discover that human factors, as it was then called, was a concern in the test reports, as the evaluations are reporting on anything from how easy it is to put your head to the eyepiece of the sight or how much strength is required to pull a steering lever. The argument on the comments of the video relates primarily to the distribution of crew duties, whether or not it was consideration at the time. And is a one-man French turret truly to be excoriated, I think that's the word, because the crewman is overworked at a time that the French didn't think it was important, or didn't care that it was important. I would argue that not only was it important, but it was explicitly important, so the division of crew duties. So for example, if you look at the documentation in Panzertrax for the design principles of the Panzer III in 1936, the German army is specifically stating that having fewer crew members to divide the combat tasks amongst was not acceptable in order to achieve more armor. I.e., the paper stats, the amount of armor, not important enough compared to the amount of crew and the ability of the crew to do their job. So for the perspective of the crewman trying to do what he needs to, he's fighting these various principles of ergonomics, whether the designers were able to acknowledge the existence of those principles or not. If I could sit down and chat with any historical tanker, who and why? I guess I kind of regret missing out on Otto Carius. Jake Devers would be an interesting one, given my personal areas of research and interest. Just how did he fight with both AGF and ordnance while he ran armoured force for most of World War II? Patrick Cordingley strikes me as being somebody I could have a good beer with. I found his book quite readable and conversational. He's a chap who commanded an armoured brigade from his tank in 1991, eschewing the command post as much as possible. He strikes me as somebody who loved his mount as much as I did. I wouldn't mind Dmitry Loza, especially in the post-Soviet environment when he felt he might be able to speak more freely, but sadly I don't speak Russian and I don't think he had much English. I'm sure Israel Tal would also have some pretty interesting stories as well. Adam Schindler. How do I go over a bump at speed in a tank without bouncing into hard or pointy bits of metal? One doesn't always succeed. I'm fairly sure more than one M1 commander has lost a tooth or nose profile on the caliber 50. The gunner gets clamped into place. There's a chest plate which basically pushes him against the backrest, so he's fairly secure, and the driver doesn't have really much room to bounce around anyway when he's lying down. So that just leaves the loader and the TC. And honestly, I do not recall any particular course of instruction on how not to get hurt by tank motion. So I guess we're kind of left to figure it out by trial and error. In my case, I kind of tended to try to self-stabilize, keeping myself more or less vertical standing on the platform as the tank would kind of bounce around me. If it looked like it was going to be a major bump though, there was nothing really for it, but sort of hold on, brace with one hand at 12, one hand at about 4, and just do my damnedest to keep myself from slamming forward and keep myself centered in the hatch. Nachtel Firokese. What does that mean? Anyway, what is the concept behind the double-gunned tanks such as the VT-1 I mentioned in QA13, or the Mammoth tank in Command & Conquer, but I'm going to ignore that. The idea for that tank, and it was a full-on turretless tank like S-Tank, not a tank destroyer, was to have a higher rate of fire. So you have 2 loaders, or 2 autoloaders, gives you almost double the firepower. Now here's a bit that kind of boggles a few folks' minds. The system was fully stabilized and intended to fire on the move. So I may mention this elsewhere, but this is a bit that a lot of folks don't understand. In modern tanks, a sight is stabilized, not the gun. The gun just tries to keep up. And this is different to the tanks of, let's say, the Sherman or Centurion era. Basically, it's a lot easier to keep 1 kilogram of mirror stable than a ton or 2 of cannon. If it's a good stabilized sight system, there's actually going to be a cutoff interlock so that the gun is not going to fire when the trigger is pulled unless the gun has actually managed to catch up with wherever it is that the sight is pointing. And such was the case in the VT-1. The sight was stabilized in rotation and elevation. When the gunner found a target, he would hold aim on it, and as the vehicle zigged and zagged in the right direction with the trigger pulled. When the gun lines up with the sight, the round was fired. Now the system wouldn't be perfect, as there would be times that elevation lost synchronization due to a bump or something just at the time that the gun was passing through the correct azimuth, or maybe the cant would be affected at the wrong time. So the workaround is that once the gun is aligned back on, the tank has to drive straight for a second or 2. I also must wonder how you deal with the parallax problem. So that's the issue with the sight and the gun not actually being the same. There's a bit of an angle. So if you look at the VT, you bore sight to one gun, then the other gun is going to be completely out of alignment with the parallax. So I guess all you can do is you just kind of aim at a really long distance and hope that the difference in the dispersion kind of work in the right direction, and you end up getting your hit. So anyway, bore sighting must have taken forever. Either way, I'd say it was an interesting but daft idea and was blissfully cancelled. Entry-level research. In can openers, I mentioned that the T70 or M18 was designed with various engines under consideration, but the R975 radial was selected due to availability, with the prospect of replacing it with the Ford V8 later. How easy would this have been? And it wasn't just availability. TD branch were so concerned about the premier first purpose designed TD that they were not going to risk it by incorporating a relatively new engine. They wanted Armored Force to basically conduct the field trials. If Armored Force liked the Ford V8, then they could install it into the M18. Now, the conversion was considered to be, quote, a very simple prospect, unquote. Just exactly how simple that prospect was is not stated in the document, just that it would be simple. Of course, Hellcat production ended up being cut before any such changes were made. The M18 was built on an extremely compressed time schedule, with the first 1,000 or so being produced before the vehicle was even acceptable for service. Indeed, the first 657 produced were to be returned to the factory for extensive modification, and numbers 658 to 1095 were to be given modifications at the depots before going overseas. You can imagine that with that sort of speed of production, there was no time being given for a review of armoured force assessments of the V8 Sherman, with the last M18 rolling off the production line in October 44. Still, given that the M4 was built with the R975 and it was able to convert successfully to the Ford GAA, it seems reasonable that the M18 conversion would leverage the lessons learned in just how to do it. Robert Henry Ilston: are tank crew members more likely to exhibit unusual, eccentric, or just plain quirks compared to others? I don't think so. Any tankers I can think of are all perfectly rational, well-rounded individuals, keeping their heads while all around them lose theirs. We do get concerned about people in other branches, though. They often just act plain weird. Reese Genvy: who had the best tank doctrine at the end of the war, and why? All competitors having full strength and serviceable effective tanks in this scenario. And that question, I think, is about as answerable as which country had the best tank. By what criterion? By the time the war was over, all the nations had a reasonable amount of experience and had thus worked out most of the kinks from their doctrines as they best suited their larger situations. After all, nobody is making doctrinal decisions in a vacuum. But oftentimes these sorts of questions presume that you have a completely blank slate and you can start whatever you want. If one country's doctrine required plastering the enemy with ungodly amounts of artillery, and they just happen to have ungodly amounts of artillery to do it with, and it worked, why not? If one country could afford to only put tanks in exploitation forces and it meant giving the infantry only assault guns, who's to say that wasn't a good doctrine for them? For the same reason, your follow-up question, is there a tank from another nation's doctrine which might suit a country better than its own? That seems to be no. The Soviets were not really capable of making Shermans. The Germans were not really capable of making enough T-34s. The chances are, if you put all the plans available into a central library and each nation could pick and choose and build what it wanted, it would probably end up taking the tanks that ended up in reality, because that's what their own industries were tooled up and capable of building. Perhaps a few features might have been stolen from one or the other nation. But for example, I still think that the Germans would take King Tiger over IS-2, and the Americans would have taken Sherman over Cromwell, and so on and so forth. I realize that this has been sort of argued to be a circular logic. I think this is the best because this is what was done. But on the other hand, the designers aren't idiots, and they did build things because they thought it was the best in the first place. And they did not have a blank slate. Even if you completely mind swap the generals, you take Tukhachevsky and you put him into German uniform, for example. Country A is still going to be short on oil, and country B is still going to be short on tungsten, so on and so forth. S-Face: are there any tanks I might consider to be successful failures where there might be a better design available, but the tank in question was produced instead due to the exigencies of war? Well, the obvious answer is T-34. The torsion bar version was supposed to have 20% more internal volume, 50% more fuel capacity, and a whole slew of other advantages. But when the Germans came knocking, the older version stayed in production. In fairness, this requires a large asterisk. There is no hard evidence that the T-34M would actually have been a better tank. We can infer from the designs, but teething troubles have a way of cropping up with their least expected, no matter what the paper designs say. It's very easy to look at the new design on paper, say it's better, and approve of it, yet when built, it doesn't meet muster. And Sherman is an excellent example of this. You look at the decision in 43 to stay with the known Sherman instead of taking a gamble on the unproven T20 series. And, with the benefit of hindsight, say that the 1944 T20s were not actually of an overall better design, given that the ones that were built failed to pass acceptance testing. But on paper, they were better tanks. So in effect, compared to T-34M, the T-20 line is penalized in such assessments by the fact that they were actually built, tested, flaws identified, which is of course the whole point of testing. I would think a similar system in the small arms world might be the SVT-40, which is dropped in favor of simpler manufacture of Mosin Nagants in greater numbers, but I am open to correction on that. I also wonder if certain Italian or Japanese tanks may not also fall under this category, being manufactured simply because they took less rare steel from, than better tanks did, or which is sort of a penny wise, pound foolish way of looking at things. But I also suspect not entirely unfounded. Also asks, do I have any speculation on the Japanese Type 4 or Type 5 tanks versus Shermans? I don't think I'm all that impressed by them. At least at an initial glance, they seem to be maybe an equivalent as opposed to better, and that's giving them the full benefits of the doubt on things like maintenance, ergonomics, and so on and so forth. Plus, by the time the things are in hypothetical production, the US is bringing along 76mm tanks and tank destroyers, which will easily have the match of them. They would be more dangerous to Shermans, yes, but I wouldn't see them as being better. Andrew, what would I consider to be the worst use of tanks with no hope of achieving their objectives? I guess I could make an argument for Task Force Bound. Hey, let's drive 100 kilometers that way, break into a prison, and then drive 100 kilometers back, whatever the distance was. I would say a bunch of operations by the Germans would count. Start with the Battle of the Bulge. Did they ever really have a hope? I mean, that was the expenditure of a large amount of the German armoured force on an impossible hope of reaching Antwerp. Did a single intelligent officer in the German army think it was actually possible? Then again, what choice had they? They had to gamble, because they were losing anyway. Even Kasserine Pass was perhaps a little bit optimistic at a large scale, even though of course it had initial tactical success. It seems to me that the hopeless use of armour is normally associated with desperation. When they've nothing more to lose, roll the dice in the chance of some incredibly lucky break. You also have to distinguish between things which, with the benefit of hindsight, may have been incredibly poor judgment and which may have made sense beforehand, or at least were considered to be cases where there was no practical alternative even when the deficiencies were known. I mean, did anybody really think that the Iraqi armoured thrust to take out Khafji was going to result in anything other than the loss of that unit? I mean, also, yes, they knew Goodwood was going to be hampered by the tank-infantry balance, but they rolled it anyway, and they just tried to mitigate the problem with artillery and air. They lost a lot of tanks, but they knew it was a probability before even starting. The job still needed to be done. Warlord Titan Tiberius. Now that the US Army realizes that SHORAD isn't a fancy word, what are some off-the-shelf solutions that the US Army could use for better short and medium air defense? He says off-the-shelf because budgets are tight and they're things the Army probably needs quickly. And honestly, I don't think there are any. You will recall in the previous video I'd suggested replacing Avenger with Panzer for better capability. I also suggested that in reality the better move would be an entirely different system. The problem is that the threat for which SHORAD is probably best suited right now is not really addressed by any of the other current systems out there. I mean, sure, the US can go and buy off-the-shelf SLAM RAM, or the NA NASMs, or whatever the Norwegians call it. Think of it as a modern version of Chaparral. It exists, it's in service, it uses missiles currently in US service, but the base reason that the US Army gave up on air defense to a large extent still exists. The sort of targets that vehicles like SLAM-RAM are supposed to go up against are already perfectly well addressed by the US Air Force. Instead, I think the primary focus needs to be against drones, especially small, unarmed drones, which will radio back intelligence. I'm sure that, in theory, a SLAM-RAM can lock onto and engage a drone the size of a Raven, or that it can be shot down with proximity-fused 4cm rounds, but the dedicated anti-drone systems such as lasers or directed jammers currently under development seems to be a far superior and cost-effective way of dealing with the things. The SHORAD system is apparently an interim being purchased on an accelerated timeline, and there is a second counter-UAS system being developed. Presumably in the long term, some system will be developed that will incorporate both. An interesting concept is that the counter-UAS turret has been fitted onto a Stryker fire support vehicle. When the UAS loses signal because of the directed jammers from the vehicle, and oftentimes they enter a return home mode if they lose their controls, if it doesn't crash, the fire support vehicle continues to track it, sees where it drops down, and then calls fire on wherever the thing has landed. It's actually kind of clever. Keep a few larger systems, even Avengers and SHORADs, just to keep the opposition honest, especially if they bring along enough air defense that the US Air Force also has to keep some distance. But as you say, budgets are tight, and I think anti-drone air defense will be a better use of money than buying more traditional AA systems. Even the SHORAD seems to be oriented a little more against the drones than against attack aircraft. Oscar Larson. Does light tank exist in modern tank forces? I addressed this in the previous Q&A and the answer is an unequivocal yes. Look at the Chinese Type 15. I would argue that the Japanese Type 16 fills this role as well, although they officially call it a maneuver combat vehicle because it has wheels. Now I should re-emphasize, I personally categorize tanks by role more than by physical characteristic. The impression I'm getting is that Type 16 performs a tank role in an easy to deploy fashion, as opposed to being a tank destroyer such as Centauro. Thailand still seems to like its Stingrays and Argentina its TAMs, although they are both getting a little bit long in the tooth and TAM is actually approaching proper tank weights. Alexander H. Can I elaborate on Stryker and its variants? That's an awfully broad question. The idea behind it was that it was supposed to increase the capability of rapidly deployable units. So you will recall in 1990, after Kuwait was invaded, the 82nd Airborne was dispatched out with its 1 unit of Sheridans to defend Saudi. They were light, they were quick to get there, and they considered themselves to be speed bumps upon arrival, pending the delivery of the heavy US Army units. Well, the Stryker Brigade was supposed to meet that need with a requirement that everything be air portable in the C-130 to get from A to B quickly. And I seem to recall seeing a document somewhere that it would take the Air Force about 3 days to get a full brigade anywhere from A to B around the globe. Which, all things considered, isn't actually bad at all. The entire force is based around a single chassis, making maintenance and supply, which also has to be flown in, remember, much simpler. In addition to being lighter and more air portable, wheeled vehicles also tend to take less maintenance and less fuel, but has to be flown in. At the time, it seemed to be a perfectly reasonable thing. There was some disquietment in the heavy armor community, but it was promised that no heavy armor would be downgraded to Stryker units. They would be given only to light infantry units, which would be brought up to Stryker levels. The Stryker variants which were created all seemed to generally fit the bill. Some improvements were to come, such as to the mortar vehicle, and the gun system famously took a while to sort out, but generally speaking, the vehicles did what they were supposed to do. Of course, eventually somebody completely lost the plot, and the promise that only light units would go Stryker went by the wayside. The final insult came in 2011, when the last operational armoured cavalry regiment in the US Army was turned into Strykers, and with it the loss of a core level capability. And 11th ACR doesn't really count despite the name. Similarly, we have the issue with the Dragoon 30mm Stryker, created to give 2nd Cavalry something to deal with BMPs and the likes, given that they're based in Germany and spend a lot of time in Eastern Europe, places like Poland and the Baltic states, where they're likely to encounter lots of BMPs if the balloon goes up. I'm sorry, is this the precise reason that we're supposed to have heavy armor units? Why is a unit specifically designed to be flown anywhere in the world in a matter of days being used to perform a role in Europe better suited to a heavy armor unit, which can perform that role better and with equipment already in service, and without having to be ship by ship all the way over? Turn 2nd Cav back into an ACR. Problem solved. I mean, we have plenty of Bradleys and Abrams sitting in storage. Now, I don't get paid to make those decisions, and I do not have access to whatever information the decision makers had when they made them. But what I know, this seems to make no sense at all. Now, don't let this above rant reflect upon either the vehicle or the organization when it's used in its intended role. I don't know of any Stryker operators who have much bad to say about their vehicles. I know one guy that thinks that they're wheeled truck death traps. That's it, but I don't give him much credence. The thing's basically a Moag Piranha. It's well tried in use around the world for a reason. Everything I've heard indicates that it's reliable, capable, and comfortable. I just think the Army went a little bit too far with the unit changeovers, which, in fairness, the Army does seem to have recognized a bit as well. Last year, 1st Brigade, 1st Armoured Division traded its Strykers in for heavy armour, making 1st Armoured Division an honest-to-God full-on heavy division again. And after a quick search, apparently the only one in the US Army. The Hearns. Is there a technical reason the US went with a 120mm smoothbore for the tanks, whilst the British went with a rifle? I think it's more a question of why did the British stick with a rifle when everybody else is going smoothbore. It's commonly stated that it's because the British love Hesh rounds, and they are more effective when fired from a rifle. This is true, but I think Finn was actually the primary armor defeating round at the time. I suspect that the reason was more economical and political. The L11 rifle was already in service, it seemed plenty good enough all things considered. Why not save money on training and supply and so on and just continue using the gun? After all, the Challenger is to a very large extent a warmed over late model Chieftain with a better engine. Plus, the factory for the ammunition was British, and if any exports for Challenger happened, great, the ammunition would have to be supplied by British industry, not by the Americans or Germans. Would the US military today be as capable of transporting tanks across the ocean in a war as they did in World War II, given that their size and weight have both increased? Yes is the short answer, but I'm going to, I think, reserve the discussion of modern armoured vehicle transport for a dedicated vehicle as well, now that you bring it up. This is assuming, of course, that the US Navy is able to stop the transports from being sunk, as there are fewer transports transporting fewer tanks. While I'm attacking it, I will also see if I can address Shu's question about tank transporters. Andrew Sebastian, how is Abrams rearmoring actually being done? It looks like they just welded steel plates over the original armor blocks. That does actually kind of seem to be the case. Remember, the front of an M1's turret is just an armored box. There's all sorts of layers of stuff inside this armored box made of secret scroll materials, which I'm not allowed to know about. It allows for moderately easy upgrades, such as the addition of depleted uranium inserts. It appears, though what they've done with the A2C is they just added another box to the front of the first box, filled it with even more super secret stuff. So I'd be curious to see the top-down view to see if there's a weld line kind of like bisecting the front, or if they just replace the roof panel with a bigger piece of metal. Joe Pallaway. What 2020 armoured vehicles would I use to equip the Rebel Alliance in the Galactic Civil War? Don't know. I have no idea what the effect of blasters is against Terran armour technology, nor the ability of the Rebel Alliance to create the fossil-based fuels which are commonly used. Neither am I aware of the relative capabilities of projectile weapons, including explosive rounds against Imperial armour. Dempsey. And he got this in right before he was about to shut down the PC for recording. We refer to the German Tiger as a heavy tank, but the Germans refer to it as a breakthrough tank. All the terms interchangeable. I'm not so sure about in German, as the units were called heavy panzer units, not breakthrough panzer units. Even though, yes, the Tiger program was originally designated as a breakthrough vehicle, and that was, in fact, its purpose. If you recall my Sherman Jumbo video, the Americans seem to consider the gun to be the defining difference between a heavy tank and an assault tank, and the latter perhaps being a breakthrough tank. The Soviets seem to equate heavy with breakthrough as well, and the British never went that way in the first place, keeping infantry and cruiser distinctions all the way through the war. After the war, things got different again, like the British heavy gun tank, emphasizing the gun, not the armour so much. But by and large, I think you can, generally speaking, equate the terms reasonably well. Stryker 1959. We hear lots from you about Sherman's strengths. What were its weaknesses? Again, bearing in mind that the vehicle is a product of its environment, some of the weaknesses like height were unavoidable. The engine has to fit. Like many vehicles, early models had unfortunate troubles, like the linkage to the periscopic sight combined with the lack of a direct vision sight. The lack of a loader's hatch is a bigger one. The suspension was a holdover from earlier tanks. There was nothing inherently wrong per se with the VVSS and narrow tracks given the requirements that the design had to meet in the late 1930s, but I do wonder if, had the Sherman designers been given the ability to use a completely blank slate instead of modifying what industry was already producing, would they have used the same system? The lack of a sight for the bow gunner seems to be a bit disappointing. All in all, though, I think a question demonstrates why Sherman was such a good tank. It may not have been exceptional at much, except being around when you need them and putting steel on target quickly, but neither was it particularly flawed at anything. Charles Charange. As the world's leading fan of the Otto Blinde, and I should say that's him, not me, what country made the best use of armoured cars in World War II? Was armoured car doctrine different from country to country? To answer the first question, I think the UK wins, but only because they used Rolls Royces for a while, which beats anything else on class alone. The long open stretches in the desert do seem to be fairly well made for armoured cars, so both the British and Italian ones could make good account of themselves. And if you're going to scout, there is very little one can say against the little diminutive Daimler Scout car. However, when it comes down specifically to armoured car doctrine, I've actually not dug into it, and for most countries, I'm not even sure where I would start looking. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that question for now. Sorry. Kazuki K. Between the large recoil spade and the additional roadwheel, I am not aware of anything done to the chassis for the T92 or T93. I do note that locking systems were installed on some of the roadwheel arms of post-war vehicles to further control the recoil, but there does not seem to be any such implementation on the T92 or T93. After a quick hunt, I do not have the test reports for those vehicles. Also wants to know, if a tank has its turret detached by explosion or tip over, how hard is it to repair the vehicle? If it's a rollover, I can't imagine any huge troubles. If it has been detached by an explosion, however, I suspect there's not going to be enough left of the hull to keep in service, or if it is, it's going to be subject to such degradation of strength that it's not going to be acceptable for service. Jenny R. In my previous video, I had mentioned how torsion bar vehicles had their wheels offset to leave room for the bars to be next to each other. Are there any cases of smaller bars, maybe half width? How did it turn out? The answer is yes. Some Soviet vehicles, such as Object 268, have torsion bars which are only a couple of feet long. There is also longitudinal torsion bar suspension, i.e. front to back, a lot parallel to the hull sides, such as you might find on Porsche vehicles. They're also short. Obviously they can work, but if they have the same range of motion and effectiveness on rough terrain, well, you can argue that. The longer the arm, the more twist you can get out of a simpler metal. Witness the double width torsion bars, either side-by-side type in the case of Panther or the bar within a tube type that the Americans played with. To my knowledge, few successful torsion bar designs don't use the full width of the vehicle. T64 seems to be the main one, and maybe that's why it has weird road wheels, but I can't figure out if there's actually a connection. Sofa mods. Sherman detractors claim dishonesty in official US records, accusing the records of altering the facts in the vehicle's favor of spreading propaganda. One also hears of Soviet records being tweaked to keep certain personnel out of the Gulag, or the Imperial Japanese Army omitting crucial information to fight the Navy. Have I encountered any examples of dubious information or blatant manipulation in official documents or otherwise ostensibly dependable sources? Now, I've seen the same claims. For example, the claim that Armoured Force lost about 1,500 people killed in World War II obviously must be fake, as thousands of tankers died screaming and burning in their Shermans. Yet they never seem to provide any substantiated alternate figures. Now, in this specific case, there is an asterisk on that 1,500, but whatever modification you want to put on it, the number is going to be astonishingly small. The answer to your question is Not really, but mainly because my digging has primarily been in test reports or in the boards of organizations specifically intended to identify and fix problems. Now, in fairness, I haven't seen any particular evidence of manipulation on these matters on any side. If a Soviet technical report came back from the engineers or a testing agency saying something, to my knowledge, they tended to be fairly honest. After all, they are trying to win a war, they're patriots, and if there is a tragic flaw in something that they're testing, it's probably not the testing agency's fault, so they are not going to be at risk from a visit from the NKVD if there's fallout. That's not to say that there aren't claims which are honestly made which are wrong. Now, I've discussed this in videos, claims by air crews on the destruction of tanks, and I have a series of written articles assessing pretty much every kill by a TD unit over a period of time in Anzio, where it's obvious that they're trying to distinguish between Panzer III, Panzer IV and Panzer VI, but they still seem to have killed twice as many Tigers as are actually present. When you start getting into the self-preservation or ass-kissing, seems to be more at the memoir level or documents written after the fact. So I'm going to read you another one from 1985. It's a book review written in the USSR about a history book. Analyzing the international situation in the pre-war years, the author shows the aggressive essence of the two opposing imperialist groupings which existed at the time, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Britain, France, United States, which were striving to settle their contradictions at the expense of the USSR. Only fascist Germany and its allies prepared to enslave the Soviet Union with their forces, while the Anglo-French-American reactionary circles attempted to achieve their objective through others, by pushing Germany into an attack on our country. In its turn, the Soviet Union, true to its Leninist foreign policy, persistently struggled to preserve and strengthen peace. In the pre-war years, it repeatedly advanced constructive plans to organize a system of collective security and curb the aggressor. However, the bourgeois governments of the European and American capitalist countries, carrying out a policy of encouraging the aggressors under various pretexts, did not embark upon cooperation with USSR. Carrying out a struggle for peace, the Communist Party and Soviet state were forced to take care to strengthen the country's defensive capability and improve the military power of the armed forces. Therefore, the pages which discuss the important measures taken to defend the fatherland, which were taken after the start of the Second World War, are of undoubted interest. Among them are the uniting of the Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia with the Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarusia, Bessarabia and Northern Bukovina with the Soviet Union, and the acceptance of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania into the fraternal family of Soviet peoples as Union republics. I suspect Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians have their own point of view on that one. As a result of these measures, our state borders were extended to the west 200 to 350 kilometers, a fact which played a large role in destroying Hitler's plans for a lightning war. As I say, I think a few people may quibble at the question of whether or not this is an accurate assessment of reality, although one may also ask whether or not the writer truly believes it, because it's probably what he was taught decades after the fact. He had no reason to think otherwise. But this is ultimately an inherently political, not a technical subject. So, no, I have no reason to believe that any of the technical or field reports submitted up from the line were sanitized, as there would be very little to gain from the submitting agencies, and there is an absence of any evidence to the contrary. Jeremy McDood. Why was not the T14 resurrected with a 3-inch or 76mm? Or, alternatively, when the requirement came about for a new assault tank in M4A3E2, why did they do that and not drag out the T14 again? The main problem with T14 was that it never really got it to work right. It had issues with the suspension and internal configuration, both crew and powertrain in particular. The track tension system was the first thing mentioned as a problem in the report, actually. If you wanted a heavy tank with a large cannon, Ordnance was always pushing for the M6 heavy tank, which Armoured Force was putting its foot down about and saying no. With the Sherman Jumbo, they're starting with a base tank that they know already works perfectly well, so it's a lot easier and simpler to play with that instead of resurrect and try to improve an older tank which never worked well to begin with. Josh Chase, why the odd wheel spacing at the front of a T-55? not really that odd. You see the space between the number 1 and 2 on the M1 as well. I presume it's just down to the weight distribution. Very far forward of the tank having less weight to support. And you'll see that the reverse seems to be the case on T62. X-selk or cross-selk. What does short tracking mean? Or according to a commentator on a previous YouTube, half tracking in the UK. If there is damage to the suspension, probably at the front, maybe by rolling over a mine, such that the track can no longer go over the idler and then back down, it can't go all the way forward and back down, a short track simply skips the few wheels, quite literally making a short track. Maybe it comes down around here. If you have to short track an M1, it can get annoying because of a need to reverse the torsion bars. Jorg wants to know why boxer engines aren't more used in AFVs. I have absolutely no clue. There are certainly pancake engines used, look at the bottom of an EBR, but boxers in general, I don't know. If somebody knows more about boxer engines and why they're not used in AFVs, comment below. All right, so that's it. It is now 11 o'clock. I still have to put my body armor together. I'm up in less than 6 hours because I got a 2-hour drive to get to the range. Is there anything else of note? I don't think so. So hopefully I will see you on the Harry Yidey stream. Again, keep an eye on my Facebook page. There's a link to that below in the text, the Chieftain Wargaming. And we can have a chat with Harry about tank destroyer operation in World War II. If this project, as I say, is well received and is popular, we'll probably end up moving it on to other authors and other books as well. And I think that's it for now. So I hope you found the Q&A interesting and informative. I will see you on the next one.